Well, it seemed like President Donald Trump might have had a case of jet lag on Wednesday night, as first he posted on Truth Social about Jimmy Kimmel, and then posted on Truth Social to say, quote, "I am pleased to inform our many USA patriots that I am designating Antifa a sick, dangerous, radical left disaster as a major terrorist organization. I will also be strongly recommending that those funding Antifa be thoroughly investigated in accordance with the highest legal standards and practices. Thank you for your attention to this matter," his signature sign-off. Want to break down what some of the costs and benefits of this designation might be. We don't actually know a whole lot about the implementation plan behind this goal right now. But before we dive in, just as a reminder, undercurrents.tv is where you can go for the full premium experience of the show. Head on over there, subscribe. We're almost at 100,000 subscribers on YouTube. So if you want to help us out, we're excited to hit that benchmark, and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts as well. Now let's dive into what this actually means. Andy Ngo, who is obviously most famous for being a reporter who looks into Antifa, has definitely put himself on the line looking into Antifa, and is obviously partial to the case that Antifa is extremely dangerous, said on X. He's been posting and commenting a lot on his no comment website, ngocomment.com. But I want to start with this post because I think it's an important one. He says, "At the end of the day, any executive declaration labeling Antifa a terrorist organization is symbolic. Trump already did it in 2020 when the riots erupted. It's not all bad news, though. Continue reading. The courts have interpreted the First Amendment to bar U.S. and local governments from banning domestic groups based on ideology. Federal terrorism laws banning membership or material support only apply to foreign terror organizations." Now, No goes on to say what matters more is the president signaling the potential use of RICO conspiracy charges against far-left militants engaged in criminal conspiracies. There are also some current criminal legislation that can be used, and some Antifa groups, like Rose City Antifa, have international links opening themselves to terrorism charges. It will take a lot of resolve, creativity, and determination for the DOJ to break up Antifa's violent extremist networks, but it can be done. Just going to pause right there for a moment and say, I never like when I hear the word creativity in the context of government crackdowns. So I get where Andy Ngo is coming from. I am just sort of allergic to the use of RICO. Maybe I'm wrong about that. I just really, from Fani Willis to some of those other cases where we've seen RICO abused, in my opinion at least, I could very easily see RICO cases being built up in the case of Antifa, where, you know, in the RICO case that Fani Willis put together about the 2020 election, included in the charging documents, the indictments, were mentions of like people booking conference rooms at hotels. You can easily, we know how these cases sometimes get abused, and I can absolutely 1000% see that happening in this case. So I would hope whatever creativity could come from this is limited, but I'll get back to that in just a second. Andy goes on to say, we've already seen this work in San Diego last year. Local prosecutors broke up SoCal Antifa with felony conspiracy convictions. Every identified member of the cell was convicted. Antifa threatened the judge and prosecutors, but they pressed through. Leftist media smeared the DA. At trial, all the evidence showing how organized SoCal Antifa was revealed. Each person was unmasked, their weapons and tactics exposed. So I'm going to stop right there and say one thing we are already seeing from the left in this case is just a complete downplaying of the coordination and the strategy that has fueled Antifa violence for years. This is why Andy Ngo's reporting was initially controversial, despite the fact that for the left, he actually shouldn't really be a very controversial figure in the early days, as he is like clearly exposing through video and reportage the serious problems with these Antifa groups that are getting ignored by so many people in the so-called mainstream media. That is going to continue happening, and it is going to be turbocharged in the next week or so as this is all discussed. And that's unfortunate because there is evidence of coordination in these cases. It's true that Antifa is, what's the right way to put it? They're not, you know, always a well-oiled machine. I say that as somebody who has covered like these types of riots and protests, covered a bunch of them here in DC during the summer of 2020. Actually was like got rubber bullets shot in my direction at one point. Had, you know, my eyes watering up from tear gas. I've been at some of these Antifa protests that turn into riots, and I've seen it. Sometimes they're shockingly coordinated. Other times it's like a ragtag bunch of, you know, it's the right way to put it, like eccentrics, misfits, who are just trying to make trouble and are in some cases maybe even trying to like find somewhere to stay and maybe get some food. It's a weird collection. And that actually does create some very dangerous and potentially violent situations, as No has reported. So I think what we're going to see is some downplaying of the obvious strategy and coordination, where you have concerted efforts to thrust particular cities, Portland being a good example, into violence, not into, defensive reactions to right-wing violence, but actually offensive actions taken in the sort of cause of anti-fascism. And so right now, you know, if we take the case of Charlie Kirk's awful assassination, will there be links to some underground Antifa network, given the mention of Bella Ciao, and some apparent anti-fascist signaling? I mean, the other mention of catch fascist, right? Is it possible that the gamer world the suspect was immersed in was overlapped, that in the middle of that Venn diagram where some people are, the shooter was in that part, and there were people who were in Antifa groups that were maybe aware and complicit? It's possible. I don't think we have the evidence right now. I think given the anti-fascist signaling, quote anti-fascist signaling, in this case, it's a perfectly legitimate line of inquiry for the government to pursue. But in other cases, as No points out, the SoCal Antifa, Rose City Antifa, there are some pretty obvious examples of coordination. And there are some examples of groups that could be looked at here. So the National Lawyers Guild is one such example. The Capital Research Organization, the Capital Research Center, has done a lot of research into the space. They're a conservative group, but you can read about National Lawyers Guild's relationship with Antifa. Are they just organizing bail funds for Antifa people that get arrested? That's something that I expect the government will probably look into in the days ahead. Right now, it's actually unclear what this major terrorist organization designation that Donald Trump announced on Truth Social is actually going to mean. What are the legal ramifications of that? What are the constitutional ramifications of that? And how is, the Department of Justice or the FBI going to carry the mantle of treating Antifa as a, quote, major terrorist organization going to manifest in practice? Unclear. That's where I would say for the right, some of this is a bit risky, of course, because my argument, just let me flesh this out, because some of you are going to have an obvious response. Part of the argument, and I don't know that it's my argument, but part of the argument would be this creates a dangerous precedent that will be abused when a Democrat comes into office. Again, just going after, quote, Christian nationalist groups or white nationalist groups or whatever, designating, maybe Doug Wilson's church, a, quote, major terrorist organization because someone, who goes to one of those churches foments violence at some point, some, random person, and there's no, background coordination or strategizing. This is just a wild hypothetical that I'm basically pulling out of a hat right now. But I know people on the right are listening to me say that and are thinking in their heads, well, that's kind of already happened in the Biden administration. And I'm going to read from a CBS report here. Christopher Wray considers, quote, far-right groups the top of the priority list at the FBI. Director Chris Wray said in February 2020 that the FBI places the risk of violence from racially motivated extremist groups, quote, on the same footing as the threat posed by foreign terrorist organizations such as ISIS and its sympathizers. And so that would, obviously, we've seen ways that the FBI abused these categories to, for example, have informants in Catholic churches in Virginia where the Latin Mass was being offered. That is a thing that happened. Scrutiny of parents who were protesting at school board meetings, also a thing that happened and that the Biden DOJ had to answer for. So the rights argument in this case is fire with fire. Fire is being fought with fire. That's a really complicated argument to parse out. And I'm not going to open up that can of worms right now. Needless to say, I think sometimes there are ways to fight fire within the constitutional boundaries. And, there are other ways that are more post-liberal that make me uncomfortable, as we've covered here in different directions, and I don't think are actually constructive. But I'm going to leave that aside from now, just for the purpose of explaining, which the media will not do, why the right is saying this isn't us on offense, this is us on defense. That's the argument. It's not being fairly depicted by the media, and it's also not coming from nowhere. There was abuse at the FBI very clearly, in many, many different ways. Also, I mentioned this on the Unheard channel last Thursday. My colleague Sohrab Ahmari and Freddie Sayers and I were talking, about 24 hours after the assassination of Charlie Kirk happened, about some of the early reaction. Was this going to morph into a complete and total crackdown? And I talked a bit about a post from Chris Rufo that invoked the example of J. Edgar Hoover cracking down on left-wing groups. And there's a reason, this gets into some of the post-liberalism. There's a reason that during the Wray era of the FBI and the Comey era of the FBI, people on the right were revisiting some of the arguments the left made in the 60s and 70s about abuses from J. Edgar Hoover's FBI or the CIA under various directors, Allen Dulles, whomever else. And I'm, very sympathetic, and still, I feel consistent with my sentiments during those years about complete and total discomfort with COINTEL style operations where people are embedded, the Gretchen Whitmer plot, for example, that the Gretchen Whitmer kidnapping plot that we found out in court later was in no small part fueled by FBI informants who were involved in that group. So these things can go in dangerous directions really quickly, and they also have unduly chilling effects on speech in ways that are, I think, unwarranted to some extent. So it makes me anxious. At the same time, of course, I'm a conservative, so I don't necessarily believe that the let's say, if we're talking about, militant left-wing groups and militant right-wing groups, do I believe that they have been treated fairly in recent years as the intelligence apparatus has become has morphed into as the realignment has happened, right? The political realignment where you see Democrats becoming more the party of affluent, upper middle class, educated voters, like higher education levels statistically. That has sort of meant the FBI is more on the side of Democrats, right? Like that's the whole Trump crackdown from Comey's FBI and the like. So I don't think that these sides have been treated in recent years fairly or neutrally in ways that make sense. So I completely understand that. I do think we have a lot of historical precedent that should give us pause as to whether Hoover did more harm than good. Did he crack down, or did in some cases Hoover foment? Did Hoover-style tactics foment? Were they really chilling, or were they actually aggravating? And, there are no really easy answers to that question, but there sure are a whole lot of scary examples of how this can go wrong. I always think of the case of Gene Seberg. I keep that one. Google it if you're not familiar with it. But how Hoover signed off on planting a rumor about Gene Seberg having a baby with a member of the Black Panther Party. It's a horrible, horrible story. I actually think they made a movie about it. But it's goes wrong really, really quickly. I do think Antifa should be, I'm not saying anything to suggest Antifa shouldn't be probed. The coordinated campaigns from Antifa, I think, are absolutely fair game for the FBI. What I'm saying here is, depending on what this major terrorist organization designation does, it's worth being careful and precise. As a conservative, I think it's worth being careful and precise with how that's wielded, even in the context of what's happened over the last 10 or so years. Not just that there are constitutional problems, but even just pragmatically, you can end up pouring gasoline on the fire, and making Antifa, for example, more sympathetic, and then driving more people to Antifa. So there are some right now. People are reasonably, deeply angry, and there was such an urgent sense of doom and destruction during the Cold War, and people were deeply scared and paranoid. And I think we're lucky right now to have the examples of those decades. So just some thoughts, as the media is already downplaying the extent to which Antifa is coordinated, the extent to which there may be foreign funding, the extent to which they are genuinely strategically violent and have been. There's some real action to be taken that would make people safer, and is within constitutional boundaries. So that's what I'm thinking about. I'm paying close attention to Andy Ngo's reporting on this, and appreciate you all sticking with us here on Undercurrents. As a reminder, undercurrents.tv is where you can go to subscribe to the full premium experience of the show. Head on over to subscribe wherever you get your podcasts, and of course on YouTube as well. We'll see you back here with more soon.